our third speaker is going to speak about this edge of understanding that is still another way of looking at communication. Arthur Kroker.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak. I'd like to talk today about Canada in the digital future. But rather than beginning in the future, I'd really like to begin in the past, and not just in any general past, but really in my own past. I'd like to tell the story of technology, in fact, my own story of technology. And so really, let me just begin by telling you about the first time I read the writings of Marshall McLuhan. I remember it very clearly. I was 17 years of age, just finished my first year of university, and went back to my hometown, which is Red Rock, 1,000 miles north of here, on the northern shore of Lake Superior. Brought a copy of McLuhan's Understanding Media back home with me. And my job that summer in the paper mill was to work in the wood room. And the wood room consists of these like huge drums, which are about 100 feet in diameter. The wood pulp comes up from the slasher at the mill, and goes inside the wood drums, which are just filled with razor sharp blades. And my job that summer was actually to take my wood pick, crawl on top of the drums, and try to avoid killing myself and clear the bark off the drums. And I just remembered night after night, because I worked the graveyard shift, just saying fervently, I hope I don't fall into the drums, which was the fate of my predecessor, who to this day in Red Rock, after he got back from the hospital, was called in Red Rock One-Turn Turner. So I remember at break times, it's 105 degrees, I'm popping salt tablets because of the heat. The noise of the drum is like just really literally stripping my mind and my nerves, just like almost stripping my body himself, and also the noise is just so intense that almost like the concrete walls are just like whomping before my eyes itself. And I just remember, breaks, I'd pick up Understanding Media and I'd read the line over and over again. The medium is the message. The medium is the message. And I didn't understand then that I was actually, the force field of, in fact, the very visible environment of technology itself, that I was within the medium itself, and I was, in fact, being sort of violently mediated. Today, every time I read Understanding Media, I can still smell the paper machines. So the first time I read Marshall McLuhan. Now, when I began my writing, I really had that sort of woodroom in mind, because I wrote a text called Technology in the Canadian Mind. And Technology in the Canadian Mind was just something that was like autobiographical, because it was about how Canadians have a very distinctive way of thinking about technology. And my perspective was that Canada's unique, eloquent, and really critical contribution to world intellectuality consists, in fact, of a really profound perspective on technology. And I looked at three, in my mind, really great Canadian thinkers, the techno-humanism and Marshall McLuhan, who, unlike Wired magazine, I think always had like a really double perspective, because McLuhan would certainly say, in a utopian way, that technology refers to, epiphanies of communication, and technology provides possibilities for universal communication. But at the same time, McLuhan would say something oftentimes like really draconian, almost like in another voice, when you say, people, we tend to think of technology as like putting our heads inside this, the invisible buzzsaw of technology and calling the whole thing freedom itself. Or you'd say that technology refers to something that does like psychic surgery in our nervous system. McLuhan had like the really double edge in his thought. And a different perspective than McLuhan's was a perspective of now like a really forgotten Helegonian philosopher, really my favorite thinker with Nietzsche, and that's the writings of George Grant. And I just remember thinking of Grant, deeply, when Grant would say that technology does not have utopia about it. Technology also has moments of great deprivation, of great moments of degeneration. And Grant would say things, and I quote, our present is like being lost in a wilderness, where every pine and rock and bay is both known and known and unknown to us, and as ambivalent pointers in the way back to human habitation. The sudden is hidden by the clouds, and even that which is good for us today is equivocal, both in detail and in definition. Or at other times, Grant would say, our future in the much hyped technological society is like dying, gasping fish on the shore of a drying lake, really gasping and starving for the oxygen of human vision itself. So, really Canadian thought, a utopian perspective, and a perspective also on the opposite side of technology is about deprivation. And there's a third perspective in Canadian thought, and that's the writings of like Harold Innis, who always wrote close to the ground, the cod fisheries, the political economy of the dairy industry, the railway, and ended his life with a bias of communication, the empire of communication. And had still, I believe, an assimilated theory of technology as both being time-binding and space-binding. And Innis, following the writings of like Nietzsche and Heidegger, said that technology contains two opposite moments, and it's up to human beings with human vision to negotiate those moments. That technology contains, at the one hand, it has great, immense saving powers about it. Technology, in fact, is Western destiny. It is human destiny. We cannot escape from it. But by virtue of the fact we cannot escape from it, technology also contains real moments of danger. And Innes's thought, in fact, honed on that very specifically. Now, since writing that text, all of my thought has really just been focused on that and attempting to think that not just within a Canadian circumstance, within a global circumstance, because I think that thinking technology is not just a dominant pattern of Canadian thought. I think thinking technology is, in fact, the essence of Canadian identity. It's what I really call the thinking technology is the Canadian algorithm. And it sort of makes a lot of sense, because like in my estimation that if you scratch a Canadian, you're always going to find a wired body. I mean, this is the only country I know where like telephones and wireless communicators are not technologies to us. They're like moments of high art, where television like provides like a portal on the storm to the south, where deep space telemetry is like almost our nervous system, and we really get off on things like the Canadian arm itself, and where the internet for us is like a bit of, I don't know, like summer sunshine on a cold winter night. I mean, thinking technology for purposes of national survival is in our electronic blood. We're all like digital Canadians. It's almost like we're like born with modems in our pockets and pixels for eyes, and with a real sense of like 3D accelerators for fast traveling through net and through the web as like the flesh of Canadians. Tech flesh is in fact very close to the flesh of Canadians itself. And if you look anywhere in Canadian culture from coast to coast, this story of technology with three perspectives, I believe, is told over and over again. This summer, for example, I went to Cape Breton, and I went back twice because I was just so emotionally taken with something in Cape Breton. I was really taken by like the technology of music, but what I just kept hearing, the sound of the fiddles of lament. And I went back again and spent weeks just traveling around in a car in like my dusty 67 red Mustang. And my feeling was like Mr. Blank, because I really felt like sort of like I don't know, just empty. I felt when I went, I felt like overcoded and over-aestheticized and over-programmed. And I didn't know what I was doing there, and I sure didn't know why I was going back there. But I went back there, really to maybe find myself and to look for myself within the Cape Breton Way itself. And I remember very clearly, for example, I went up in the trail up north, and I was on the Cape Smoky Lookoff, and it was completely filled with, it was like the afternoon, but it was completely filled with fog. The air was just completely foggy, and you couldn't see anything at all, except you could see through the clouds, through the fog, you could see like the tiny patch of the Atlantic Ocean below. And I stopped the car, and I'd actually Mackay's really sad fiddle of lament playing on the really loud on the car radio, which was called Sad Wedding Day. And I just, I was like, I was like, just stood there, and I just felt like my heart was going out and my hurt was going on. And I was thinking of the road, and I was thinking of the song. And I was on the Cape Smoky Lookoff, but I was looking off into life itself. And that kind of feeling where there's a connection, I think, between geography and the technology of sound and your own personal history is, I think, the Canadian story, which is told again and again. And it's not just told in Cape Breton, but you can go to, for example, the masks of the Haida, where you put on the spirit mask and you begin to have the technology of flesh comes onto your face, and you yourself become the shamanistic spirit. You become the eagle spirit or the trickster raven. You take on the spirit, for example, of the people of the clamshell itself. Or even as I speak this afternoon, like a friend of mine, David Christian, I just know will be back in Montreal, in the Verdun in Montreal. He's an electronic musician, and I just know, because this is what he does almost 24 hours a day, because he's retelling the story of Canadian technology. He'll have his MIDI processor full beamed up high. He'll have his earphones on, and he'll be listening intently to the sound of static coming from Hydro-Quebec. Take single sounds of static and begin to translate them into fantastic orchestras of like the sound of mech flesh itself, the sound of what it means to travel through the digital vortex. So for myself, the story of like technology as the Canadian mind and technology as the Canadian algorithm is told in every aspect of our history and of our culture itself. And the project that I'm interested in, is really a result of this, is like in some ways like a noble project, but it's preposterous because it's difficulty. It's human difficulty, but not its technological difficulty. Because I think, that at this time in my life, and if I just speak, autobiographically, at this time in my life, I feel that as a result of studies and other people teaching, I'm a teacher, taught in the universities for a quarter of a century, and I'm a writer, and I'm a citizen of this country and a citizen of the world. I think what this country really needs on the basis of its technology, and really on the basis of thinking technology as a Canadian algorithm, is I really think that we need to develop a new national university in Canada, which would be an electronic university. And by that, I don't mean simply reproducing what we have now, which I think really has some problems. I think the old university structure that we have is one, and Don Tapscott's right, if you just translate it to education. It's mechanical, it's hierarchical, it's narrow specialties, it kills the imagination of the young as much as it can. Like typical problems when you get like bureaucracies in education. But on the other hand, I don't think that we need to simply import from the United States or from wherever, or from Canada, a business model of education. Because in all the universities right now, there's just this tremendous political will to deliver up the university to these $25,000 or $50,000 MBAs and to forget all the rest of the universities. For myself, I much more firmly believe in like the perspective of Northrop Frye, who spoke about a country really needing education for not simply improved binoculars, but I would say for like improved netscaping in some ways. That universities and education are really fundamental to the cultural life of the society itself. And I think that it's even more important because what is happening in Canada right now is that just because we are in many ways living next to the spearhead of modernity in the United States, and at the same time are far away from our immigrant roots, that the results of the Canadian experiment are of world importance. And so it would mean that we need to create something strikingly new. And that's true of any small Nordic country culture like Canada, because if we don't create something new in our culture and in our education, we in fact will cease to exist. We'll simply be homogenized. So I would suggest, really thinking technology like using the backbone, which already physically exists right across this country, to in fact create real, genuine convergence. And by convergence, I don't just mean, the digital language of bringing together different medias and different technologies. I mean genuine cultural convergence. Like an electronic university that would bring together, for example, a friend of mine in Inuvik who's writing new philosophy called the Bush Papers, bringing together that perspective with perspectives from Rimouski, or bringing together the really, the aesthetic perspectives of, the wonderful, digital art which goes on every day in the streets of Montreal, like in the Cirque du Soleil, but at Fou-Fon Electrique and Uzensé, with, for example, the real lament which comes from the eastern provinces of this country. Genuine forms of convergence where the university itself begins to be, electronic university, begins to be a high wire act in some ways. And you cut away the guide wires. You, in fact, have a university again as a point of saving power and a point of great danger. It's, in fact, begins to express the possibility of like an imminent possibility itself. And I'd just like to conclude by contrasting what could be a Canadian possibility with other things. Last month I was down in San Jose, California, because I was really interested in seeing a new digital art installation there, which some of you may have seen, called The Future of Reading. And I went in, to the Tech Museum, and it's a fantastic exhibition because scientists and engineers and artists from Xerox PARC got together, and they really thought through from a product basis of how you could have new technologies in reading. And it's really great, just really in-depth participation. You sit down, for example, in a chair, you put on you run your hands across the page, and you suddenly begin to feel and hear the story of like a cool cat actually exploring the jazz denizens of the city of San Francisco itself. Or you go see a beautiful light table, and the beautiful light table has text, which if you touch the light table and move it up and down, it begins to fall off the page itself. Or you have screens in which you have a text running across the screen, you touch the screen, and suddenly the text begins to implode and explode into different forms of tech itself. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. And it wasn't really till I got back to Toronto, and really thought about that, because I thought it was really innovative and interesting, that I thought probably in Canada, it's just conceivable we might have done something else. Like, our fate is not to be a software country like the United States, nor to be like a hardware empire in some ways like Japan or other countries. Canada is, for better or for worse, and I think for better, it's a wetware society. Canada is, in fact, a society of content. And so I think that the small Canadian addition in some ways to the future of reading would, in fact, be to introduce a writer into the program itself and begin to see how the technologies can really begin to implement new forms of technology. Because I think the Canadian future is not simply about the future of reading, but I think what we do best in some ways is really reading the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.